Look at this map of the world and tell me what you see. Lines, thousands of them, dividing continents, splitting communities, and reshaping the course of human history. But here's what most people don't realize. Those lines aren't just administrative boundaries. They're the silent architects of every major conflict we see today. So, let me break this down. Borders are relatively recent inventions in the grand scheme of human history. For thousands of years, people moved across landscapes, guided by natural features. Rivers, mountains, deserts, forests. Communities formed around resources and climate. Trade routes connected distant peoples. There was fluidity. Then came the age of nation-states, and everything changed. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 introduced the concept of sovereign borders, and by the time European powers were colonizing the world in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were drawing lines on maps without ever setting foot on the land they were dividing. Think about that. Powerful people in London, Paris, Berlin, and Madrid were literally drawing borders across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia using rulers and ink. They weren't considering ethnic groups, religious communities, trade networks, or natural geographic divisions. They were dividing resources and establishing spheres of influence. The consequences of those decisions are still playing out today, and that's what makes this so important to understand. Now, here's the thing about borders. They create winners and losers immediately. When you draw a line, you're saying that people on this side have one set of rights, resources, and opportunities, while people on that side have another. You're determining who controls water resources, mineral deposits, agricultural land, and access to trade routes. You're separating families and communities that have lived together for centuries, and you're creating the conditions for tension, resentment, and eventually conflict. The United Nations estimates that there are over 900 disputed border areas in the world right now. 900. That's not a small number. These aren't theoretical problems either. They're active sources of tension between nations, and they directly impact the lives of millions of people living in border regions. Let's look at a specific example. The partition of India in 1947 created two nations from one. The British drew a border, and suddenly 15 million people had to choose which side they wanted to be on. Hindus in Muslim-majority areas had to leave. Muslims in Hindu-majority areas had to leave. The migration was chaotic, violent, and traumatic. Estimates suggest between 200,000 and 2 million people lost their lives during partition. And here's the crucial part. India and Pakistan have fought multiple conflicts over the decades, largely because of disputes over territory, resources, and the legacy of that arbitrary border. The Kashmir region, which was divided between the two nations, has been a flashpoint for conflict ever since. One border, drawn by colonial administrators, has shaped the destiny of 1.5 billion people across two nations. But borders don't just create conflicts between nations, they create internal instability too. When borders are drawn without regard for ethnic, religious, or cultural boundaries, you get states where different groups are forced to live together under one government. Sometimes that works through compromise and democratic institutions. Often, it doesn't. You get majority groups dominating minority groups. You get resource competition. You get marginalization and resentment. And eventually, you get conflict. Look at Syria, Iraq, or Myanmar. These borders were drawn by colonial powers without considering the complex mosaic of ethnic and religious communities living there. The result? Decades of internal strife, civil conflicts, and humanitarian crises. The borders themselves didn't cause all of this, but they created the conditions that made conflict more likely. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you've been thinking about how borders shape the world, if you've been considering how the lines drawn by past empires continue to impact billions of people today, then you need to subscribe to this channel. We explore these strategic geography topics in depth, and every video is designed to help you understand the world more clearly. Hit that subscribe button, and you'll get notifications whenever we upload new content about geopolitics, borders, and global strategy. This is the kind of knowledge that changes how you see the news, how you understand international relations, and how you think about the future. So subscribe now, and let's keep exploring these critical topics together. Now let's zoom out across the broader patterns we see in geopolitics. If you look at the map of the world, you'll notice something interesting. The most unstable regions are often the ones with the most disputed borders. The Middle East has some of the most complex border disputes on the planet. The Israel-Palestine border, the Saudi-Qatari border, the Turkey-Syria border, the Iran-Iraq border. And what do you see in that region? Constant conflict, constant tension. Is it because the people there are inherently more prone to conflict? No, it's because the borders themselves are contested. They were drawn without local input, and they divide resources and communities in ways that create ongoing friction. Take the Crimean Peninsula. For centuries, it was part of the Russian Empire. Then the Soviet Union transferred it to Ukraine in 1954, when both were part of the same country and the border seemed irrelevant. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became independent, that border suddenly mattered. Russia saw Crimea as strategically important and culturally Russian. Ukraine saw it as part of its sovereign territory. The result? A conflict that continues to this day. One border shifted on a bureaucrat's desk decades earlier shaped the geopolitical reality of the 21st century. This is the power of borders. They're not just lines on a map. They're determinants of national survival, sources of pride and identity, and flashpoints for conflict. Here's what I want you to understand. Borders shape conflicts, but they also shape survival. Nations with secure defensible borders and access to critical resources are more likely to survive and thrive. Nations with indefensible borders, limited resources, and internal divisions are more vulnerable. It's not saying that geography is destiny in an absolute sense, but it is saying that geography creates constraints and opportunities that shape how nations develop and how conflicts emerge. A nation landlocked and surrounded by hostile neighbors faces different challenges than a nation with secure coastlines and friendly neighbors. A nation sitting on oil reserves faces different incentives than a nation with minimal natural resources. A nation with ethnically homogeneous borders faces different internal dynamics than a nation with deeply divided populations. Let me give you another example. Look at Europe. For centuries, Europe was a patchwork of constantly shifting borders and endless conflicts. Why? Because the borders didn't align with natural geographic features, ethnic groups, or economic realities. Nations were constantly fighting over territory. But something changed after World War II. European nations realized that the constant redrawing of borders and the conflicts that came with it were unsustainable. So they did something radical. They started integrating economically and politically. They created institutions like the European Union that made the borders less relevant for economic activity and less worth fighting over. The result? The longest period of peace in European history. The borders are still there, but they're less consequential because the underlying economic and political structures have changed. This shows that borders don't have to lead to conflict if the incentives are aligned differently. But here's where it gets interesting. In other parts of the world, borders continue to be sources of major conflict. The Korean Peninsula is divided by one of the most militarized borders on Earth. North Korea and South Korea have been separated since 1953, and the border itself has become a symbol of their divided nation. The border between Israel and Palestine remains one of the most contested pieces of territory on the planet. The border between India and Pakistan continues to be a source of tension and occasional military confrontations. Why? Because unlike Europe, these regions haven't found ways to reduce the stakes of their border disputes. The borders still determine access to resources, security, and national identity in ways that make compromise difficult. Now, I want you to think about this from a strategic perspective. When nations are designing their grand strategies, borders are central to their thinking. A nation that controls key choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz or the Suez Canal, has enormous leverage. A nation that controls mountain passes or river valleys has natural defensive advantages. A nation that controls trade routes can extract wealth and influence. This is why empires throughout history have been obsessed with expanding their borders. It's not just about pride or ideology. It's about power and survival. Control of territory means control of resources, control of trade, control of strategic depth, and control of population. These are the fundamental currencies of international power. So here's what I want you to do. First, watch our next video about the most disputed borders in the world. We go into detail about specific border conflicts and what makes them so intractable. Second, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We're constantly uploading videos about strategic geography, geopolitics, and global strategy. These are the topics that shape our future, and understanding them is essential for anyone who wants to be informed about the world. Third, share this video with someone who cares about understanding global politics. The more people who understand how borders shape conflicts, the more informed our world will be. The more informed our collective conversations about foreign policy and international relations become. Understanding borders is understanding power. It's understanding history. It's understanding why the world looks the way it does, and why certain regions face the challenges they do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.